Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about our post-truth present and our transhuman future, with the aim of sketching out the outlines of what awaits us in the years and the decades ahead of us. This podcast is brought to you by Rocos. Companies with limited IT budgets and personnel can now get the same cybersecurity protection as big enterprises. Rocos' Secure Access Service Edge, SASE solution, with zero trust, provides enterprise-grade comprehensive cybersecurity so that you can focus on your business. For more, please visit www.rocos.com. That's ROQOS.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.
And we're live. Professor Steve Fuller, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to start by taking a couple of minutes to lay out my starting position, and then after that, we can kick off the conversation. And here's my statement. So to prepare for this conversation, I read two of your books. First one is Post-Truth, Knowledge as Power, as a Power Game, published in 2018 by Anthem Press. And the second one is A Player's Guide to the Post-Truth Condition, published in 2020, and also by Anthem Press. I'll say that I enjoyed reading both of those books, and I do recommend them to anyone out there who wants to be provoked into thinking about some of the most important questions about time. Now, both books are available on any platform, I believe, that sells books. So I'm going to start by reading three quotes from your books. The first one is from Post-Truth, and the other two are from A Player's Guide. So here goes quote one. Aristotle invented the concept of contingency to capture the idea that claims about the future are neither true nor false before the fact, but will become true or false depending on what happens. However, this concept occludes the question of who controls the scope of the possible in terms of which something turns out to happen or not happen. An early opponent of Aristotle on this point was the Alexandrian philosopher Diodorus Cronus, who argued that the future is either impossible or necessary, given that the future seems indeterminate only because we do not know whether it will play by the same rules of the game that we currently do. This shift, this is the quote continues, the shift in perspective puts one in a post-truth frame of mind. It sees the actual world as just one of many possible worlds, any of which might be actionable under the right conditions. Okay, that's the first quote. The next two quotes from The Player's Guide. Quote one, in the past, experts have experienced a form of cognitive authoritarianism. They have enjoyed a monopoly license to turn uncertainty to their advantage by dictating the name of the game that everyone else should be playing. In the post-truth condition, that monopoly is broken, resulting in a free market with multiple competitors, which effectively democratizes control over uncertainty. And the last quote, again from The Player's Guide, the post-truth condition should not be feared, but embraced as a sign of this project's genuine democratization. Authority is finally being devolved from a vanguard class to experts with a monopoly of moral and political force to some yet to be defined organization of independent self-legislating individuals. End of quotes. Okay, so let me start by saying that I am completely aligned and sympathetic with what I just read. I really have very little to quibble about as such. And I'll say that I was surprised that after reading all the comparing from where I started to where I finished, that I was so much in agreement. But my worry revolves around the big question of, yes, but what is to be done? How is it to be done? And let me explain briefly. First, and I have 3 points, and I'll be done. First, assume that we have moved. This is me talking. First, assume that we have moved from the stifling world of self-serving, jealous, turf-loving, boundary-setting, licensed experts to a free market of multiple competitors. Now, we know from the world of merchandising and product marketing that all things being equal, what often determines which product wins and which one loses is financing and marketing dollars. It is branding and advertising. To the extent that you agree with this analogy, do you think that this should worry us? Maybe I'll stop here because I have two other questions, but maybe you can address that one, and then I can maybe touch on the other two.
Okay. First of all, yes, I do think there is something to be concerned about. I would say, though, that there are a couple of ways of looking at this. First of all, it doesn't necessarily follow that just because a certain agent currently in the game has a kind of disproportionately large hold over what happens, it doesn't follow that that will be permanent. And though it is true in capitalism, there's a lot of sort of interlocked, interlinked kind of resource issues. So if you're sort of dominant in one field, you end up being dominant in another field. And of course, Google is an example of that in terms of the world in which we live. But it is one of the ways in which, as it were, the name of the game can change and has changed through the history of capitalism, has been through a change in the medium. Okay, so if you look at, let's say, the transition from the industrial to the post-industrial world, which is a massive change in the name of the game, you might say, right? Where in a sense the Ford Motor Company and these kinds of players in a way get displaced by these new players that come on the scene very quickly and of course establish a new kind of monopoly, but they're basically different players, and we're talking about the Googles, the Amazons, Microsoft, people like that, right? And that's a change in the name of the game, which ends up really kind of shifting what the game's about and how you play it, and who's as it were better positioned to capitalize in whatever uncertainty is going on. And so capitalism actually does allow for that, right? And this is the creative destruction aspect that Joseph Schumpeter spoke so much about in capitalism, which effectively by changing the rules of the game, you de facto break up monopolies that way, right? So you don't break up monopolies by, in a sense, bringing the government in to enable fair competition, but rather you basically change what the game is about, right? What the economy is about, right? And so it seems to me, so the thing that's Schumpeter's example is Henry Ford, and the way in which not only does he introduce this automobile. He's not the only person to introduce an automobile in the late 19th, early 20th century, but he's the one who ends up turning it into an infrastructure, which has all kinds of other things going on, which effectively creates a new game, right? A new game for capitalism, which a lot of other industries grow around. And you might say with the rise of the personal computer, right, in the 1980s, that you start to get something like that happening, and then a lot of industries kind of grow up around that. It seems to me that that's an example, right, in terms of how, players who had been dominant in the past. So like you think about the big three automakers in the United States who were pretty much controlling the show for most of the 20th century, how they get very quickly displaced. Okay. And so obviously that's not a complete answer to your question, because I do think these kinds of events that I've just been recounting are relatively rare. And they also presuppose a confluence of lots of other different factors in the background. So the Cold War, for example, having to do with the development of Silicon Valley and then all the technology coming from that. But nevertheless, these things do happen, right? I think part of what's going on, is the fact that uncertainty in a sense is real, right? And it's something that nobody has full control over, even if they are a monopoly player in the game that they're in, right? And we, of course, know, this is also, if you want to look at evolutionary theory, for example, right, there's an enormous amount of discussion there about over-adaptation, right? Where a particular species that's been successful in a certain ecological niche, for example, right, in a sense, kind of ends up dominating the niche, but all you need to happen is for the climate to change, right? And then all of a sudden, all the adaptation behavior just doesn't matter anymore. And that's, that's how evolutionary change often happens, right? That way. And so in a way, one of the problems, and this goes to the point, in the first post-truth book I wrote, where I talk a lot about Vilfredo Pareto and about the lions and the foxes, right? That the lions, who are basically they're the standard bearers for the establishment, right? They're the people who, in a sense, are in control of the game, right? Which the foxes are then trying to undermine, basically. But the foxes themselves are trained in the game, right? So the point is, we're not talking about real outsiders here, in a sense, right? We're talking about people who kind of both understand, right, the game as it exists, but they have different stakes in perpetuating the game. One, as it were, relies and depends on the game being perpetuated, but the others do not, right? And so they're quite happy, and it would be to their advantage to actually change the game. And so you do. And now what, this kind of stuff happens all the time. Pareto's point, was basically that this is kind of the cyclical way in which politics works, right? Especially if you imagine politics, even in democracies, being governed by a circulation of elites, which is kind of what he thought parliamentary democracy was at the end of the day. But of course, you can imagine this, as something that kind of, in a way, naturally happens through generational change. Okay, basically, when you get a new generation of people who have yet to be invested in the old ways of doing things, right? And perhaps they might be somewhat dislocated, perhaps because there could be labor market issues, right? So, for example, again, a good example of over-adaptation that I was mentioning earlier is the idea that you have these dominant players who then school and train all these other people who are going to be following in their footsteps, but they basically train too many of them, right? And they can't all succeed. Right. And so and then after a while, if you get enough of that kind of, overspill, as it were, right, then you start getting this newer generation questioning, what's the point of sticking around with this? Right. We basically have to pull up our stakes and do something else. And they might even develop quite a deliberately hostile attitude toward the establishment for not having, as it were, rewarded them for having spent the time learning about what it's about. You see, so these kinds of things, there are lots of different ways, right, in which this kind of displacement, this changing of the name of the game can take place, over the course, of history and so forth. And it can come from many different directions. So one shouldn't assume that monopolies, no matter how stable they've been in the past, will carry on that way indefinitely.
You're right. Clearly, history shows that monopolies do not necessarily survive, and they're replaced by something else. The question is, are we going from monopoly to monopoly to monopoly? All right. So Microsoft was a monopoly, and then it was displaced by Google. Right. And Facebook was not monopoly at the beginning, but Friendster was sort of like a monopoly, or MySpace, and they were displaced, and there is a new monopoly in that. As opposed to what I think, what you're saying, is exciting, which is you have a potpourri of folks who, of companies, none of them dominating the space. And I think that's where we want to go. We don't want to just go from monopoly to monopoly. We want to go to something a lot more different, right? And if to the extent that is doable, that is reliable, we can have multiple social networks, we can have multiple search engines, not one Google engine, right? That we can have multiple Office suite software, not just Microsoft, right? Leveraging that metaphor and going to the world of ideas and knowledge and knowledge creation, right? To the extent that we have not been able to get to a world where we have little Microsofts and little Googles and little, right? To the extent that has been hard, do you think that, to the extent that you agree with that, do you think that also will happen when we go to a world where you have different islands of experts and so forth, right? And so my question is, given that what we have seen is the market has to be regulated. If you let the market just go on its own, it will start quickly moving towards consolidation in the name of scalability, efficiency, effectiveness, quality control, viability, right? And is there a reason to believe that the same won't happen here in the post-truth world, right? That you won't have, if we're going to introduce mechanisms to ensure that the free market remains open to and free, who is going to do that in the post-truth world? Some new overseeing authority? And if so, are we not going back to the pre-post truth state? Are you following my question?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising an interesting point, and I think the way I would approach this, because in this regard, I'm quite sympathetic to the existence of the state performing kind of the role that you're talking about. If we're talking about the post-truth condition as kind of imagining the world as a game, right, then one of the things that we want to do, and this includes thinking about capitalism and the market as a game, is we want to make sure that the game is played fairly, right? And so there's issues not only about what the rules are explicitly, which you might say is comparable to the laws, right? But then there's also what counts as fair play. Right. Yeah. And because one of the things that you don't want, and it's one of the things that in a way makes a game kind of unattractive generally, is if the same people are always winning.
Yeah.
Right. And even though, right, as you know, in European football, we have Premier Leagues and second order leagues and so forth. Nevertheless, it is possible to rise up the ranks and so forth. And it's not completely predictable who's going to win all the time. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which not only the way the rules are formally set up, but also kind of the background conditions that ensure fair play.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that this is, that there is a sense in which the problem with the market as it exists, especially in the minds of laissez-faire capitalist types, is that they basically want a game in which the players are self-governing, right? So in other words, the players kind of determine what the rules are as they're going along. And this is part of this so-called when people like Hayek and a lot of these, very radical kind of liberal economists talk about, spontaneously self-generating order. Yeah. Right. What that basically means is the guys who enter the field first determine what the rules are and in a way stabilize the game. Right. I mean, it's kind of what. Right. And so what they're actually imagining, right, that in a sense, the stability of the market comes from the big players. Right. Basically putting a kind of boundary around what the competition ends up being. You see.
Yeah.
Now you see, this is not what I mean when I talk about game, right? A game actually has as it were, you might say, a separation of powers implied in it, right?
Okay.
Where you have the players playing amongst themselves, but you also have rules and referees, and you have all of this other apparatus, right? That in a way governs the structure of the game as it's going on, and that is relatively independent, even transcendent perhaps, of what's actually going on. And this is where I think the state can play a role, and where, antitrust legislation and the spirit of that kind of move, which was very much part of progressive politics in the early 20th century, right, is very much in the spirit of keeping the game fair.
Sure.
Right. And so I'm actually quite sympathetic with that.
But what's the equivalent of that in a world of knowledge? Right, where you have competing, where you don't have, let's say, institutions that stamp, certificates and so forth only, right? You have other places where you can get experts and so on. So, if you let that market just be completely unregulated, right? And if we take seriously the proposition that there is consolidation and all that, why don't we think that that's going to happen? Even if we were to reach a place where we have, various players and all that, why don't we, what would keep from what is the equivalent of the state to ensure that there is an ecosystem of these?
Well, see, this is where the university, in a kind of reinvented way, could play an important role. Okay. So while people who read these two post-truth books of mine will see that I'm quite critical of a lot of the practices in the universities as they exist now. And in fact, I even predict there'll be a kind of reformation where the university will lose its kind of Catholic church-like status, right? And there will be a kind of devolution of the university in a sense. And I think that is likely to happen. But then the question becomes, what is the university good for in this kind of new world we're talking about? And it seems to me the university is the place where people, it's not where people develop expertise, but rather it's a place where people develop judgment. And what that's about is basically being able to discriminate between competing expertises, right? With regard to matters of interest to them. And so in a sense, if I had to, kind of, put my finger on what is the thing that a university education ought to be able to give you that you can't get elsewhere, it would be a kind of connoisseurship, an ability, as it were, to be able to judge, to compare, right, different kinds of knowledge claims that are being made in domains where you have a particular interest. So it might be medical, issues, it might be climate issues, whatever. And you have all these different people claiming authority on all kinds of different bases, mobilizing these facts, that facts, whatever. And then, what do you do? Right. Well, you're not, you don't answer that question by saying, okay, who's the most expert? Right. I mean, the point about expertise, I think that really needs to be driven home. And this is something I've always stressed in my writing from my first book, Social Epistemology, is that expertise is basically about colonization, epistemic colonization. Right. So in other words, expertise in the first instance, if we talk about what it is that you learn when you get the kind of knowledge that gives you a credential that then says you're an expert, right? That kind of knowledge is usually developed in very specialized environment initially, right? So you take all these courses, right? You pass all these exams, you might do some research, but the research itself is under very kind of tight methodological conditions, at least in relation to how the real world operates. And this is how you develop your expertise. So it's kind of hot-housed in a way, right? In a very specific kind of environment. But then you're let loose, you're given credentials, and then you're able to colonize the world with it, right? So, you say, I got a degree in economics. Now I'm going to tell you how to run your business, right? Now I'm going to tell you how to run the government, right? I mean, this is what economists are doing all the time, right? And they're not alone. And so in a way, this is kind of the nature of expertise, right? Is to colonize. In other words, to actually go beyond what they were strictly taught, which is actually a much more abstract, formal kind of thing, passing exams where they're Mickey Mouse questions that they have to get right, and now they're in the big bad world that's very complex, and their job as an expert is to make sense of it. And typically what experts end up doing is to simplify, right? They end up simplifying in a way that biases their knowledge, right? So in other words, if you're an economist and you're asked to figure out, what's going to happen in the future, you basically apply some economic models, right? And the things that don't fit nicely into those models just disappear from sight.
Sure.
Okay.
But
that's the nature of expertise, right? Now, the thing is, there's a million of these guys around, people from different fields, all pretending to be experts. And usually what they're pretending to be experts about are about things that are very complex, very kind of amorphous, do not have a natural disciplinary home. Okay. And then you, as the member of the public, have to discriminate amongst them. You have to say, okay, who do I believe, right? And so even if you believe, for example, that you need an economist to sort something out, which economist do you believe, right? And it's going to be up to you, right? And this is where a university education can come in, because it in principle could allow you to make these kinds of judgments, which are largely comparative judgments, whereby you're trying to measure the relevance and significance of different types of expertise being brought to bear on a situation of concern to you.
Yeah. Well, I think here's a function of expertise that I would love to hear you respond to. Okay. So in many companies, right, they will bring a consultant from outside, right, to help them make a decision. Okay. And they don't care like who, right? As long as they're reasonable, they bring them in, all right? And they bring them in not necessarily for their expertise as such, right? But so that if the project fails, right, somebody outside of the company will be blamed.
Yeah.
Right. So they're useful in that way, and they make a lot of money that way. Another one. So that's one example of one reaction to what you just said, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And secondly, I mean, we as human individuals living in society, we need to act and to do things. I need to buy stuff. I need to buy fish, and I need to buy organic food, and so on, right? And let's say if in our household everything is organic. My wife is one of those radicals, right? Everything is organic, right? And so we were having a discussion about, well, how do you know that it's actually organic? It has the stamp on it, right? And she's very skeptical, but she's and you'd like her. She hates experts, right? And so organic. So you have to look at it very closely, because sometimes they will say organically flavored, right? So it's not necessarily organic and flavored, right? So here you have somebody who is very discriminating, but she needs to buy organic food. And where does she go to buy organic food, and whom does she listen to, and how does she vet, right? She doesn't have time to vet stuff like that, right? As much as she wants to. So then it becomes a question of, we need the experts to make decisions, and we need to have a level of trust in some folks. And there are some decisions that are harder than others. Some of them where you can do your research, you can be informed and make the decision. Others, there's no way really for you to know whether something is organic or not, other than to inspect and to make sure that these certifying agencies are legit. So those are two things. One is the expert as a tool, so to speak, and the other one is as a human being living in society. How do I make decisions without experts?
Yeah, but see, okay, but these two things have something in common. I want to draw attention to. It's something else I don't particularly like about the whole expert culture that you're talking about here, is this business of trust, which is a hostage to fortune, basically. You know, so the idea being, right, that as you said in the first example, right, if the consultant makes suggests something and the company follows it, and then the company,
the project goes bad,
then the expert gets blamed, and they say, well, we trusted the expert, right? And then in the second case, right, with your wife, I mean, she's got to trust someone to figure out what kind of organic food to buy. Now it seems to me the problem with the idea of trust, right, in these contexts, is that it somehow displaces personal responsibility for the judgment. Okay. And that's the thing, in a way, I from a moral standpoint, what bothers me about expertise is, in a sense, you're sort of not taking, this is where the Protestants were complaining about the Catholics, right? What part of what Protestantism didn't like about Catholicism was that your spiritual life was in the hands of a priest, right? And it wasn't you encountering the word of God directly, as it were, staking your life on a certain reading of the Bible that may either save or damn you, which is the Protestant way to go. That's why evangelists are the way they are. But rather what you do is you offload to the priest, who will listen to your sins, will tell you kind of what to do. You just follow the man's advice, and everything will be okay, and you'll get to heaven eventually, right? And it seems to me that the culture of expertise encourages this kind of moral laxness with regard to knowledge, right? And it also, and if you take it really seriously in the long term, especially all these people out there who keep on saying that we live in this incredibly complex world that's just getting more complex by the day, and people know, less and, more and more about less and less, and we have to be trusting someone else for almost everything we do. Right. I mean, this is kind of there is this logic, as it were, this kind of inexorable logic of expertise as being part of the growth of knowledge, that what it ends up doing is it ends up infantilizing, human judgment, because basically it all just ends up turning out to, who do I trust? Where is daddy? And it seems to me that this is not what the Enlightenment was supposed to be about. Okay, when the Enlightenment was about, free inquiry and the free pursuit of knowledge and all of this wonderful stuff, right? The last thing these guys were imagining is that we would live in a culture run by experts where we're dependent on them for everything we do, right? But what that means is if we're not dependent on experts in this kind of way you've been suggesting, then people have to take risks, right? And I think this is where it gets kind of interesting and tricky.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo. Brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.